Camera looks good. Audio looks good. All right, Tim. Action.
Hello, my name's Tim Malone and I'm a retired history instructor. I taught American history at Elgin Community College for 25 years. Today, I want to talk about progressivism, the progressive era in American history. Progressivism. It's a very pertinent and important word in American history, and it's a very important and pertinent word in current 2024 American politics. I myself describe myself politically as a progressive. And of course, what that means is kind of simple. I believe, and progressives believe, in progress. Now you might say, well, duh, but that's an important aspect of one's political views. Do you believe in progress? A progressive believes in progress. What does that mean? That means that politically, a progressive strives to make things better as time goes on. A progressive believes in building on what we have and making it better. Progress, progressivism. And there's an entire era of American history called the Progressive Era. Progressivism. The Progressive Era, there's a chapter in every history textbook. American history textbooks. And again, throughout these series of lectures that I've posted on YouTube, I've talked about the fact that as an American history instructor at Elgin Community College over the years, textbook manufacturers, is that the correct term to use? You manufacture textbooks? I guess you do. Would send me American history textbooks for the survey classes in American history, which is what I taught predominantly. First half, second half, American history. They'd send me textbooks for free in an effort to solicit my using their textbook in my classes. So as I've mentioned before, I have 28, 29, 30 different American history textbooks in my office at home. And every single one of them has a chapter on the Progressive Era. It's a staple, it's standard, the Progressive Era. Now, as with most eras, most isms, there's some debate about dating the Progressive Era. I date the Progressive Era 1901 to 1917. 17 years, the Progressive Era. From the ascension of Teddy Roosevelt to the presidency upon the assassination of William McKinley in 1901. McKinley was reelected in 1900. He'd first been elected in 1896. In 1900, McKinley ran for re-election. Now, McKinley's a rock-ribbed conservative Republican, big business, corporate Republican, William McKinley. In 1900, when he runs for re-election, he switches his vice presidential candidate. I don't even remember who it was the first 4 years, but he takes on Teddy Roosevelt, the young governor of New York. Teddy Roosevelt, one of the more famous Americans, Teddy Roosevelt. And then within a couple of months of taking office in his second term, McKinley's shot and assassinated, and Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. The reason McKinley chose Roosevelt for his second run was because Roosevelt was known as a progressive Republican. Teddy Roosevelt, governor of New York. Before that, he had been police commissioner in New York City and was known as a reformer, was known as a progressive. And progressivism, the idea of progressivism, had become such a salient aspect of American politics that McKinley, not a progressive, thought that, wow, this progressive strain is growing. I better pick as my vice president a progressive to cover that wing of the Republican Party. Because as we'll see, both major parties in the late 1800s and the early 1900s had progressive wings. And Roosevelt was on the progressive wing of the Republican Party. McKinley, again, not a progressive, chose Roosevelt to be his running mate to placate, to appeal to the progressive wing of the Republican Party. And then McKinley ends up getting assassinated, and all of a sudden a progressive Republican is president. Now, at some point, I could do an entire lecture on Teddy Roosevelt. He's on Mount Rushmore. He's generally considered to be one of the better presidents we had because he will serve almost all of McKinley's second term and then run for re-election in 1904 and get elected president in his own right and serve 4 years to 1908. Now, of course, Roosevelt could have run again in 1908, but he won't. That's a complicated story because he will run again on a third party, progressive party, in 1912, which brings us Woodrow Wilson. And we'll talk about that when we lecture about Woodrow Wilson. Coming attractions. So I date progressivism from the ascension of Teddy Roosevelt to the presidency in 1901 to American entry into World War I in 1917. 17 years. The progressive era. Now there's several points I want to make about progressivism and the progressive era. Progressivism. It's the historical template for later reform movements in U.S. history. In other words, even today, when you talk about reform movements in American politics, in American society, they're based upon the progressive era template. What do I mean by that? Voluntary groups of citizens pressuring the politicians to change the system. Pressure groups, single issue groups. That's how, ever since the progressive era, over 100 years ago, that's how reform is structured in the United States of America. There's been efforts throughout that span at third-party political, that way to reform, to replace the two. That's never worked. It hasn't worked. What has worked is so-called non-political, non-partisan groups, like environmental groups or the civil rights groups, election reform groups. They form private, voluntary pressure groups. And they go to the Republicans and they go to the Democrats and they pressure them on their issue. That's how reform has been structured ever since the progressive era. The progressives did that. In fact, many currently existing reform groups were originally founded during the progressive era. For example, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the premier civil rights group, pressuring the two parties to give African Americans their full rights as American citizens. Founded during the progressive era. Planned Parenthood, the group by Margaret Sanger, to give women the choice to control their reproductive tract. Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger, founded during the progressive era. Various conservation groups environmental groups, wildlife groups, founded during the Progressive era. It was the era of reform groups. Progressivism will influence Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt, as a young man during the Progressive era, was a progressive, was a self-proclaimed progressive. And then he, of course, becomes president during the Great Depression and brings forward the New Deal, one of the great reform movements, one of the great successful reform movements. Franklin Roosevelt's a progressive. Now, they become known more as New Dealers during his time as president. But the New Deal is in the tracks of, in the rut of, the Progressive era. Harry Truman is a progressive when he was a younger man. Progressivism is at the historical root of what passes for American liberalism generally. In other words, I'm a liberal, a progressive liberal. The grandparent movement of my liberalism today is the progressive movement. Progressive, New Deal, modern liberalism in 2024. That's the lineage. Another thing to know about progressivism is it's a compromise. As you might expect from a pressure group type of model, it's a compromise. It's a synthesis. After the American political system rejects extreme laissez-faire capitalism, which is what McKinley represented, which is what post-World War, post-Civil War, that dramatic rise of American industrial power after the Civil War in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, the advent of social Darwinism, the idea that the rich are the fittest and therefore they deserve their wealth. Late 1800s. That's just too extreme. It fosters slums and ghettos. It fosters poison in the rivers and in the air. Extreme laissez-faire capitalism. Now what's funny, of course, is that the progressive movement rises in response to the excesses of corporate power. That point of view is still relevant, still prevalent in the United States. There's still social Darwinistic, conservative people around today who would do away with progressive reforms and New Deal reforms and like environmental reforms. I find that kind of hard to believe because, well, I'm a progressive, right? I don't want to go back. You know, there's people who want to go back. I believe in progress. I believe progress has been, well, it's created the prosperity that we have today. Progressivism. It's simple. You build towards a better world. You solve problems. A progressive is a problem solver. It's a synthesis. After the political system rejects extreme laissez-faire capitalism, radical labor socialism, and the third-party threat of populism, again, around the turn of the century back then, there was violent labor disputes. The Great Railway Strike in 1877, the Pullman Strike in Chicago in the 1890s, where federal troops called out by these guys like McKinley, called out by the federal government to shoot down workers. Literally, shoot them down. That was where we were. The progressive movement is a reaction against that. You shouldn't shoot down striking workers. Okay, I'm down with that. The progressive movement is a system-friendly residue of reform. In other words, you had real socialists, real anarchists, strikers, militant violence, and then you have the laissez-faire capitalists, and progressivism is a compromise, a synthesis. We're not going to create a third party. We're not going to overthrow the government in some sort of worker-led rebellion. We're going to work within the system to solve the problems. Progressivism, the system-friendly reform movement. Don't want to overthrow, work within the system. That there's room within the system to solve these problems. That's a perennial tension amongst reformers. I remember back in the 1960s, Vietnam War, the anti-war movement, the tension between, the weathermen, let's get out in the street and knock some heads, let's blow up the building in Madison, and the others are, no, let's back Gene McCarthy, let's vote, let's work within the system, that's reform movements. And it's a real cleavage because, for example, the Vietnam War, millions, a couple of million, and we don't really know. Of course, I'll do a lecture on the Vietnam War coming up. 2 million Vietnamese were killed by the United States during the Vietnam War. My country, what the hell? Bombed the hell out of Vietnam. For what? In retrospect, in historical retrospect, for what? Maybe we should have been in the streets knocking police heads and getting our heads knocked. But no, the progressive movement is you work within the system. And so there's sort of a dialectical approach to this. You had the thesis is laissez-faire capitalism. The antithesis is the radical response. And then the synthesis is progressivism. To look at it in a dialectical framework. Along the same line, talking about progressivism, it's nonpartisan. Both major parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, have progressive wings. And we talked about that tension with McKinley choosing Roosevelt. McKinley, who's a laissez-faire, shoot the strikers down kind of guy. And then Roosevelt. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, again, I think I said this earlier, a very interesting historical figure because he's not a liberal. Well, he's a very conflicted figure, I think, Teddy Roosevelt. I should do a lecture on him, just him, Teddy Roosevelt, because they say, for example, that he invented modern politics. That when he became president, he's the first president to hold a press conference. He's the first president to openly campaign for the presidency. Believe it or not, before Roosevelt, it was tradition for a presidential candidate to sit at his house throughout the campaign, to send surrogates out to give the speeches and the rallies. And it was called the front porch strategy. Like McKinley, he'd come out and the reporters would be there and he'd stay home. He wouldn't travel the country. He'd stay home and come out once a day or every other day, and talk from his front porch and then go back in. That was tradition. Roosevelt changes that. Roosevelt becomes the first, get on the train, go around the country, give a different spot, campaign actively. Then it was from the back of a train car. But he invented that, Roosevelt. He was an activist in the sense that, you know, he was a vigor, right? A manly man, Teddy Roosevelt, although I think he was quite small in stature. He was a cowboy. He was born in Manhattan, Teddy Roosevelt, and he was a sickly, frail child. And at some point, his parents, who were quite wealthy, they were Manhattan Roosevelts. Franklin Roosevelt will be one of them too. And they sent him out to South Dakota, I think, to a dude ranch, and he took to it, and he became a cowboy from Manhattan. He warmed to it, the cowboy motif. Mark Hanna, who was William McKinley's campaign manager and a senator, a very conservative fellow from Ohio. Of course, McKinley was from Ohio, too. When McKinley's shot and killed and Roosevelt becomes president, Mark Hanna is reported as saying, now we got that damn cowboy for president. Both parties have progressive wings. Progressivism operates mostly within the two-party system, despite the fact that in 1912, Roosevelt will come out of retirement and run as a third-party candidate for a progressive party. But I'm making a broader point here. Mostly, progressivism operates within the two-party system. And that's how reform movements operate today, within the two-party system. Third parties have never had, well, I think Roosevelt in 1912 was the most successful third-party candidate in our history. He got more votes than the incumbent president, William Howard Taft, although Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, beats both of them in 1912. We'll talk about the 1912 election again. The election of 1912 shows how progressivism had conquered American politics. In 1912, again, Roosevelt's reelected in his own right in 1904. He could have run again in 1908, but he decides to retire. He's still in his 40s. I mean, he was the youngest guy to be president until JFK, John F. Kennedy. And his hand-chosen successor, William Howard Taft. Roosevelt backs him, and Taft wins in 1908. William Howard Taft. Now, Roosevelt, of course, backed Taft to succeed him because he thought Taft was a progressive. And Taft generally is considered to be a progressive, although not as progressive as Roosevelt. And some historians have said that Taft was a bogus progressive, that he really was a McKinley type, hardcore, laissez-faire, shoot the workers down. And Roosevelt becomes disenchanted with Taft as president and comes out of retirement and runs against Taft in the Republican primaries in 1912. Of course, Taft is the incumbent, so Taft beats Roosevelt in the primaries to remain the Republican candidate for president, and then Roosevelt walks out of the Republican convention and forms the Progressive Party and runs as a third-party candidate against Taft and Woodrow Wilson as the Democrat. The election of 1912. Very influential election, as it turns out, because it brings us Woodrow Wilson. Now, I'm going to talk to you in a lecture about Woodrow Wilson, who is, again, like Teddy Roosevelt, generally considered to be one of our better presidents, and I just hate him. I hate Woodrow Wilson. What a terrible human being. What a terrible president. Oh, no, he's not a terrible president. He's one of our best presidents. Well, I'm off the reservation. Oh, this is complicated. I'll come back to it because Wilsonianism, there's an ism, an ideology named after Wilson, Wilsonianism, and in a lot of important ways, I'm a Wilsonian, but I hate Wilson. We'll get to that, maybe in the next lecture. But by 1912, you can make the argument that progressivism, that everybody's a progressive. In 1912, Taft, Roosevelt, and Wilson all ran as progressives, all three of them. Now you can say, well, Taft, you can make an argument that all three of them were bogus, faux progressives, masquerading as progressives to get elected. All three of them. Well, I guess we'll see about that. At any rate, the incumbent president, William Howard Taft, finishes third. Roosevelt beats him, but Wilson beats both of them in the election of 1912. Another point about progressivism, it has three strands: economic reform, political reform, and social reform. Now you might say, well, duh, what's left? But it's useful to look at it that way. The first two, economic reform and political reform, are usually considered to be liberal by today's standards, while the third, social reform, is generally considered to be conservative by today's standards. The three strands are shown in the progressive amendments to the Constitution. Oh, yeah. Boy, we can't forget that. The progressive movement creates amendments to the Constitution of the United States. Amendments. Fundamental change to the Constitution. The progressive amendments. 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendments. 16, 17, 18, and 19 amendments are added during the Progressive era, or soon thereafter, the process being started during the Progressive era. Now, I should go through each one of these amendments. I encourage you to get out a copy of the Constitution and look at them yourself. 16th Amendment, the income tax. Yes, the income tax. Oh, what a topic in American history. Because of the way the original Constitution was written about fundraising for the federal government, the federal government couldn't tax income. Now, during the Civil War, the federal government imposed an income tax and collected revenue under an income tax. Helped win the war. Probably won the war. The income tax in the North during the Civil War. However, there were citizens who thought that it was unconstitutional, and they sued. So now, the war is over. Civil War is over. And the Supreme Court declares the Civil War era income tax unconstitutional. And Chase, the Secretary of Treasury under Lincoln for a time, by the time that case reaches the Supreme Court, Chase is on the Supreme Court. Chase had championed and collected the income tax during the Civil War, and then he's on the Supreme Court when the case gets there, and he votes against the income tax. He calls the income tax that he championed and collected during the Civil War, when Chase is on the Supreme Court, the war is over, declares it unconstitutional. So at any rate, one of the reforms that the progressives wanted was an income tax, because In the period after the Civil War, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, you get John D. Rockefeller and Morgan and these men who are richer than anybody's ever been rich before, Vanderbilt, Carnegie. And one of the reforms that the progressives wanted was an income tax on these vast fortunes. But they needed a constitutional amendment. So they offered the 16th Amendment, which passes. And that's why we have an income tax today, the income tax. And by the way, you know, boy, Americans love to complain about taxes generally and the income tax in particular. They just love it. It's a perennial. I don't mind the income tax. A progressive income tax where the rich pay more, pay a higher percentage of their income is perfectly reasonable to me. It's progressive. Well, that's what they call it, the progressive income tax. Not because it was during the progressive era, but because as your income goes up, your taxation, your percentage of your taxes you pay go up. Progressive, it's progressive. I'm all in favor of that. And you can make the argument that American prosperity in the last 100 years is based upon the income tax. The income tax created modern American prosperity. It's been a good thing. It's worked. Now, of course, you know, it can always be reformed and always be improved. But the 16th Amendment, economic reform, it's fundamental economic reform. It creates a federal government that has the ability to do things like respond to wars, respond to disasters. It gives the federal government the power to do things, build bridges and roads and respond to natural disasters and pandemics and mainly war, right? th Amendment is the direct election of senators. Under the original Constitution, senators were elected by the state legislatures in each state. So in other words, in Illinois, the state legislature in Springfield would appoint senators, 2 senators. So see, this is a political reform. This is the idea that progressives were democratic, small d, that there's a democratic strain to progressivism. Senators should not be appointed by state legislatures, which all the history books say was a notoriously corrupt system, that money changed hands in these state capitals. You could buy a senatorship. No, let the people elect their senators, which is what we do today. The direct election of senators, 17th Amendment. It's a political reform and it's a democratic reform. Now, I don't know if I'm going to get into this, but the progressives were not, I want to say the progressives were racists. Progressivism did not have a plank about ending Jim Crow, about giving African Americans, not just African Americans, but we usually talk about African Americans at this time in our history as being oppressed, lynched, denied the right to vote. Progressivism was for whites. That doesn't mean that there weren't African American progressives, that there weren't African Americans who tried to make civil rights part of progressivism. But progressivism is not, doesn't have a civil rights aspect to it that amounts to anything. Progressivism is for whites. Now we get to the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment, the only amendment that's overturned, that's rescinded. So you guys know what I'm talking about. Anti-alcohol. Prohibition in the federal Constitution. That prohibition aspect is part of progressivism. A lot of people say it's puritanical. There's a puritanical aspect to progressivism. And it shows up in the 18th Amendment. We're going to keep those damn workers from drinking. That alcohol and drug consumption is a sign of corruption and weakness, and it should be prohibited. Prohibition. Prohibited. And boy, oh boy, you know, we still, right? Now, I was part of the war on drugs in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. The prohibition of marijuana. I was part of that. On the how stupid, right? And there's that famous Onion, the satirical newspaper, the Onion headline, "Drugs Win War on Drugs." But there was this puritanical, we're going to regulate recreational drug use, was part of progressivism. It was considered progress to ban alcohol and other drugs too. You know, the reefer madness about marijuana came out of the progressive era. And we're still trying to prohibit, to legislate illegality on recreational drugs. And it doesn't work. I mean, addiction should be treated as a medical condition, not as a criminal justice system. That's my opinion, and I think that's progressive. Not back 100 years ago. Progressivism was involved in prohibition, morals, public morals. Puritanical. We talked about Puritanism in one of my preceding lectures. There's a puritanical aspect to progressivism. Income tax, direct election of senators, prohibition of alcohol. And then, of course, the 19th Amendment, women's vote. Now, that's 1919. I said that progressivism is 1901 to 1917, but still the process of getting the Women's Rights Amendment passed started during the progressive era. It's kind of the end point of it, 1919, women's vote. That's a progressive idea. Again, that's a political reform, and it's kind of mind-blowing today to think that even that long ago, not that long ago, that women couldn't vote? What the hell kind of democracy is that? The progressive era brought women to vote. We're still fighting those gender issues in 2024. Another point about progressivism is that its conservation aspect is the historical forerunner of today's environmental movement. There was a conservation aspect to progressivism. It might be its most important legacy. Teddy Roosevelt, most famous for getting the national forests, national parks, national grasslands. All that comes out of progressivism. All that idea that certain parts of the country should be set aside, conserved. That's what it was called then, conservation. Now it's called environmentalism. But it's the same ethos, it's the same impulse. Not everything should be privatized. There's also, an aspect along these lines of the parks movement. P-A-R-K-S, parks. Not just at a federal level, but at a local and state level. It's quite a phenomenon. Almost any town or city here in Illinois, here in the Midwest, across the country, if you say, well, I live in Belvedere, Illinois, and Belvedere Park is a large, beautiful park run by a park district, elected members of a park district. My wife and I were just walking in Belvedere Park yesterday looking at the leaves. It's October. Beautiful. The Kishwaukee River runs through the length of the park. It's large. It's a wonderful place. Founded during the Progressive Era. And just about any town you go to in the United States, if you look at their park district, if you look at their parks, founded during the Progressive Era, there was a parks movement, which was part of the Progressive Era. Conservation, public spaces for the public, set aside, conserved. That's progressivism. You know, maybe I should have started there about progressivism. The parks movement. Now, let me just finish up here by saying that the progressive era is controversial amongst historians. There's dozens of interpretations of who progressives were and why they did what they did. All the way from, weren't they wonderful, civic-minded people, to this progressivism is just a front for the corporations. It's just a way to get the reformers off our back. Here's your progressive movement here. Okay, go over there. Meanwhile, we'll keep dumping the mercury into the lake. And there was a lot of mercury dumped into a lot of lakes during and after the progressive movement. There still is. Too much. So I don't want to get into the various interpretations because they're multiple. And some historians say that the whole idea of a progressive era and a progressive movement gives the wrong idea of what happened during that period of time. That it's an ethos. It's not a movement. It's ill-defined. It's fuzzy. What is it? Who were they? Can't tell. But I guess I'm on the side that there was really something there, and go to your park in your town or city, and there's progressivism for you.